Many people may come to mind when thinking about racial segregation, like Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks. The process of ending segregation started in the 1950s and lasted through the 1960s. Back then, it was a constant struggle for both whites and blacks to get justice. Segregation began as a result of the desire for white Southerners to regain control over the freed slaves after the end of the Civil War. In 1865 and 1866, special laws only applying to blacks, referred to as black codes, were adopted by the legislatures of the southern states. In the 1890s, a new form of black codes were constructed on the beliefs that whites were highly superior to blacks. Jim Crow laws, as they were called, made it illegal for whites and blacks to share public facilities and were much more rigid than previous laws. They legalized anti-black racism through the mid-1960s. Over time, some blacks protested their unfair treatment. On June 7th of 1892, Homer Plessy deliberately sat in the white section of a rail car and identified himself as being of colored descent. He was arrested and jailed for this crime. The Plessy versus Ferguson case reached the United States Supreme Court. The Plessy decision set the precedent that separate facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional as long as they were equal. It provided a legal means for whites to ignore their obligations set forth in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The message being conveyed was clear: discrimination against blacks is acceptable. One main point that drove the laws and movements to end segregation was that children are, and always will be, our future. Strong figures behind civil movements believed that if we wanted a society that is blind to color, we had to begin the change at the most impressionable age. Under the title of Brown versus Board of Education, 5 cases tried to end the separation of all white and all black schools. It was argued that because the schools were separate, African American children were seen as inferior to white children, and this should not be permissible by law. As they were trying to come to a decision, the Supreme Court realized that they were divided about the issue, and they could not come to a decision in time. They decided to rehear the case in December of 1953. During this time between the cases, one of the Chief Justices, Fred Vinson, passed away. Chief Justice Earl Warren replaced him. Warren was able to do something that Vinson was not able to do, and that was to unify the Supreme Court in the decision that the segregation of schools was unconstitutional. The ruling was not immediately implemented, though. The Supreme Court asked those states affected by the law to come up with their own plans to implement it. With the hearing of Brown versus Board of Education finalizing the movement to desegregate schools, the next toughest challenge was going to be carrying out the desegregation. With concern of southern states not following orders, the Supreme Court justices ordered that desegregation was to proceed with all deliberate speed. The movement that ended up being the most productive in the ending of segregation in schools was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After threatening to cut sufficient federal funding for not complying with the segregating of schools, the percentage of classrooms rose. Segregation is nothing new to our society. Throughout history, many races, as well as cultures, have been separated. However, to deprive our children of the basic rights, such as their education, is inhumane. Many children were not necessarily denied their education, but they were denied a safe and equal one. Racial segregation includes the racial segregation of services, housing service, medical care, employment opportunities, transportation, and very importantly, educations. During this time in history, not as many white parents would send their children to a school that has African Americans attending. Alexander versus Holmes is a very important court case in the termination of segregation in American schools, but receives little attention. In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled immediate action in the public school facilities. This would be recognized as the most definite known end to segregation amongst schools. Many believe this ruling was responding to the legal challenges from anti-immigrationists who had learned that the legal system could potentially be used to sustain social objectives. However, they were majorly defeated after the Supreme Court had ruled that Mississippi, and eventually the rest of the nation, was obligated to integrate all of their public schools. De facto segregation is the voluntary separation or isolation of racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups in a community, leading to neighborhood schools attended by students from one group. De facto segregation typically happens in public schools and happens by fact rather than by legal requirements. During the 1950s and 60s, segregation was simply discrimination that was not segregation by law. Expecting African Americans to ride in the back of buses and separate but equal facilities are known instances of de facto segregation throughout history. The NAACP fought for de facto segregation practices to be abolished. Public schools in any region of the U.S. may be de facto racially segregated simply because they are in neighborhoods whose residents are all, or nearly all, of one race. A local example appears in Sioux Falls. There are low-income communities throughout Sioux Falls. These low-income communities and schools are more likely to have minority children and ELL students. The opposite of de facto segregation is de jure segregation. Under de jure segregation, the law provided entirely separate schools for black and white students, which they legally had to attend. In many cases, the schools for black students were older and had fewer resources of all kinds, and paid their teachers less than in white schools. The journey for desegregation started long before anyone may have realized, and is still going on in some areas of the world today. To come as far as this nation, and other nations have, is a great start, but there is always more work to be done.